And welcome back to the show. John Iadarola here. Week 5, still unnamed. You might have noticed that. I guess we're just going to continue with that theme for a couple of months. Big international news is going to head off the show today. Just a little spoiler for the rest of the episode. It is going to be a pretty serious day of news, actually. I love talking about the mega potatoes in Japan and Iceland banning porn as much as the next guy, but sometimes the important stuff has to take precedence. So we are going to be starting with some international news. Then we're going to be rounding up important domestic political news from around the country. And finally, as always, I will be responding to some of your interesting Twitter and YouTube comments, because I know that people enjoy that. But we're going to be starting off with the most important story of the day. The Occupy Gezi protests continue, now in their 4th day, the protest expanding outside of Istanbul and now spreading across most of Turkey. If you're not familiar with the Occupy Gezi protests, I'm not surprised. It's not getting much mainstream coverage in America, and it's getting almost no coverage whatsoever in Turkey. That's one of the reasons I think it's important to focus on it. Now, thanks to Twitter and other social media outlets, we are getting some information about what's been happening, but so far, probably because of government pressure, information through Turkish news has been almost non-existent. So, let me get you up to date with what's been happening by going over a quick timeline of the Occupy Gezi protests. Now, it started just a couple of days ago on the 28th. There was a planned demolition of the Taksim Gezi Park and Square. Now, this was a green area, I guess. It had trees, it had a park, and it was going to be demolished to make way for several buildings, including a planned mall. Now, thanks to, on the 28th, about 50 protesters showing up, they were able to stop the walls around the park from being demolished. Now, eventually, those would be demolished when the police intervened. And then by the 29th, one day later, there was a lot more, there were bigger crowds that were developing. Some local celebrities had shown up. They did a press conference. They showed films there to try to rally support. And on into the 29th, the protests were just gaining speed, I guess. This also happened on the 30th. Now, at this point, because of the inability of the planned demolition to go ahead, the police started to amp up their response to the protests. And on the 31st, when crowds had started to number in the hundreds, we did have our first outbreak of violence. Now, up until this point, the protesters are saying that they're protesting in incredibly, totally non-violent fashion. But the police did strike out with tear gas, water cannons, pepper spray, and things of that sort. At least 100 were injured. There were scuffles between protesters and the police, actual fights breaking out, and not just these crowd control measures. And now, at this point on the 31st, we're talking about just yesterday, by the way, the protests had moved outside of just Istanbul. Satellite protests had started around Turkey. Crowds in some places reported up to 10,000 people in size, and mass imprisonments had also begun. Just in Istanbul, just at the actual, the Gezi protest, at least 60 were arrested in one move. Now, that's the basic timeline. As I've said, these protests have spread throughout Turkey. We're finally getting some coverage in the American media. Now, the Turkish media still is not talking about it much, and the theory is that the Turkish government is putting a lot of pressure on them. And so you have a very interesting disconnect inside of Turkey, where it's one of the most popular, most fiery subjects, I guess, being talked about on Twitter, but you turn to the actual news and you see almost nothing, despite the fact that you can look out your window and see protests in many different cities, many different towns. Now, both the U.S. government and the Turkish government have released statements. First, the Turkish Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan has said, wherever you go in the world, in places like this, governments would take measures, referring to what some perceive to be a heavy-handed response to the nonviolent protests. And just on Saturday, actually just earlier today, he called for an immediate end to the protests. Not entirely surprised by that. The U.S. government is... I guess they're being a little bit cautious, but they are giving at least some support to the protesters. We have a statement from the United States State Department spokesperson Jen Psaki. She says, "We believe that Turkey's long-term stability, security, and prosperity is best guaranteed by upholding the fundamental freedoms of expression, assembly, and association, which is what it seems these individuals were doing." Now, if you haven't heard more about these protests before, you might wonder why, just because of the demolition of this park, the protests would expand in the way that they have. Well, it's not called Occupy Gezi just because that's the new in thing, that's the new meme. The actual nature of the protests has followed a similar trajectory as the Occupy Wall Street protests did in America. Now, originally, it was a mostly environmental, urban planning sort of protest. They didn't like the space being taken away. But steadily, that has grown to include other grievances against the government. Now, if you know anything about Turkish politics, you know that historically it has been, especially in that region, an incredibly secular government. But steadily over the past few years, over the last decade, there has been a greater influx of Islamic influence over the government. And you've seen that reflected in policies in Turkey. Now, there have been some silly policies, I think, that I can totally understand them opposing, such as bans on public displays of affection, limitations on how much alcohol can be consumed and sold, infringements on free speech and things like that. And so you see the growth of not just government power, but specifically the Islamic influence in government power increasing in Turkey today. And so now what started as a purely environmental protest has grown to include a number of different grievances against different aspects of Turkish society and government, similar to how the Occupy protests expanded over time in America. Now, we're only 4 days into these protests, and especially as an outsider, it's impossible for me to really speculate as to what will happen. We've seen some, I guess, counterforce from the police. There has been, as we said, a number of injuries, a number of arrests. There has not yet been any deaths, thankfully. And when you're talking about protests numbering in the hundreds, thousands, and tens of thousands, that actually in the modern day is, I think, a silver lining on what's going on there. Now, from what I've learned about the Occupy Gezi protests, my word of advice would be that while it seemed at first in America that the disparate nature, the lacking in central leadership nature of the Occupy Wall Street protests would be a strength in the long run, it did make it incredibly easy for the mainstream media to marginalize these people as lacking a central message, a central mission. I don't know that that will be replicated in Turkey today, but it is a concern for those who want these protests to have some lingering impact on Turkish government. I don't know if they will be able to organize around a single message, since as yet, as I said, there are a number of disparate issues that are being worked on. But we will be keeping you apprised. This is the first episode of our show that has happened during these protests. I expect that, considering how they've swept across Turkey like political wildfire, they will still be around next week, and so I'll update you then. As of now, because the protesters have not engaged in any sort of violent protests against the government, I wish them the best, and we will keep you apprised. Now, moving back to American politics, I want to give you an update on a story that broke a number of days ago and an interesting little consequence of what happened. As you know, at this point, Michelle Bachmann has retired. She will not be running for another term in Congress. As Cenk would say, we got her, I guess. Mission accomplished, I suppose. One guy who you might not have expected to be mimicking or mirroring that statement is Jim Graves. Now, he's the hotel magnate who had, up until very recently, just a few days ago, been running against Michelle Bachmann. He also is the man that ran against Michelle Bachmann in the last congressional race, narrowly losing to her by just a couple of percentage points. So Michelle Bachmann announces via her very long, rambling YouTube video that she will be retiring. And now he is saying that he will also be dropping out of the race. Now, this was met with, a lot of confusion. Why would a man that only narrowly lost a race for Congress last time around drop out when whoever it is that will replace Michelle Bachmann this time around will almost certainly have a lower chance of winning, if for no other reason than lower name recognition and fundraising capacity? But he says that he will be dropping out. Now, we're going to read for you his statement, and then I'll do a bit of speculation as to what might actually be going on. Jim Graves says, basically, after all that's gone on, and with Michelle Bachmann now stepping down, I've been talking to my friends and family, and frankly, the feeling is mission accomplished. She wasn't representing the people of the 6th District appropriately, and now she won't be representing them. There's no way anyone could run and win who would be worse than Michelle Bachmann. So we accomplished that task. He's mostly correct there. I think that he should look up some of the statements of Louis Gohmert, Ted Cruz perhaps, also the poke the holes in the earth guy and oil comes out. He might be worse, but she is one of the worst, and so I understand that sentiment. Now, when the news broke that she would not be running again, there was discussions going on around the studio about why he might actually be dropping out, and Cenk believes, without any evidence yet, that there has to be something behind it. Either he was engaged in some sort of scandal that will come out in the next few months, something like that. I actually, at this point, am going to put myself on the record and say that I think he is actually being genuine. Now, I know that in American government that's pretty rare at this point, but I think that it's possible that he actually was just running against her because he directly opposed her policies, rather than simply saying that as a means to get a spot in American government. He is a very rich man. He's going to be perfectly fine. Now, I understand that that has not stopped other rich Americans from running for Senate and House seats. But I think that in this case, it's possible that he is actually doing what we say people should do. Run on the actual issues, run against politicians that you oppose because you actually oppose them, and not as just an expedient means to enter American government. And it is possible that that is actually what's going on. Now, turning to Michelle Bachmann, she is not going to be continuing on in the House. We have seen no signs yet that she will be running for any sort of higher office, Senate, the presidency, although I would not be surprised if she tried again in 2016. A little bit of good news for those of you who might be worried about her chances if she was to run in 2016, Democrats, I should say. There's a national poll polling what people think about Michelle Bachmann. Nationally, she has a 40% disapproval rating, a 33% favorable rating. Those are not good numbers if you want to run for president. And similar to Hillary Clinton, she is very well known across the country. The chance that she would be able to make some sort of massive and durable change to those favorable, unfavorable numbers are pretty low. She has almost universal name recognition at this point. And so I guess I'll bid Jim Graves adieu. Thank you very much for putting whatever pressure you did on her. If you contributed to her retiring, we appreciate it. And to Michelle Bachmann, your move. Moving now across the country to California, a bit of local political news, I guess, since we are filming in LA. The California Senate recently voted on a bill that would take away the Boy Scouts of America's tax-exempt status. Now, this is not law yet, but it has cleared one of the major hurdles towards becoming law. Now, just to give you an idea of why that is, you might be wondering, I mean, after all, the Boy Scouts did just make a somewhat of a backpedal on their ban on homosexual members. They are allowing boys up until 18 to be openly gay in the Boy Scouts, but those above that and Boy Scout leaders obviously will not be able to be gay. So it's a bit of a compromise, I suppose, and now California makes this move. So we have a statement from California State Senator Ricardo Lara of Long Beach. He says, while the Boy Scouts of America took a step in the right direction to include LGBT youth, the standing ban on LGBT adults is premised on absurd assumptions and stereotypes that perpetuate homophobia and ignorance. Goes on to say, equality does not come with an expiration date, and we shouldn't allow discrimination to be subsidized, not in our state, not on our dime. That is a very nice little, a couple of turns of political phrase there, the expiration date on discrimination. I like that. Might be national aspirations for Ricardo Lara there. And so, look, I made clear when I was covering some of the biggest freakouts, some of the biggest overreactions to the Boy Scouts compromise coming from right-wingers last week, that I do not like this compromise. I think that they are trying to drag their heels on being pulled into the modern era as much as they can. And I think that something does need to be done to get them to open up their doors to not just 17-year-old openly gay members, but Boy Scout leaders as well. Now, the question is this the right way to go? Putting sort of, state financial pressure on the organization. I think that if you're a state senator in California, this is just about all you can do, and so I understand the sentiment. I would say that in a perfect world, we would not be just punishing them financially state by state for their political policies, I guess. I think that the only way to get the Boy Scouts of America to make a durable change to their policies is for the parents of the Scouts, local politicians across the country, people like that, to appeal to the Boy Scouts to change. I think they need to understand that they're not just simply going to lose 6 or 7% of their profits in a particular state if they continue on this way, but that perhaps some other organization will rise up and take their place, one that better reflects the values and ethics of the modern era. I think that that's just a better way for us to go. Now, I like that they're doing something. I like that if nothing else, small bills like this, when they're covered at the state level, will keep the spotlight on the policies of the BSA. But right now, I think that it's unlikely that this by itself will have much of an effect on causing them to once again change their policies. So good move, probably not going to be all that significant. Moving on, let's go back to a story we talked about a couple of weeks ago. The 3D gun movement, the 3D printed gun movement, I should say, is gaining strength. We saw the Liberator gun debut just a couple of weeks ago an entirely 3D printed, or I should say almost entirely 3D printed gun, you do need a metal firing pin, and the plans do include for a larger piece of metal that would stop this gun from going through metal detectors, but of course that piece can be taken out and the gun is still functional. Now, I'm not going to get into a discussion yet again about the ethics or morality of spreading these blueprints. I'm not going to talk about whether it's a good thing for the country in general that these gun blueprints are out there for good. But there's an interesting consequence of these 3D printed guns. Will 3D printed guns possibly take down the NRA? Now that seems like a bit of an overstatement at this point, since all we've seen so far is that single-shot Liberator pistol, but there's new information coming out that, lead to some silver lining, I suppose, in this issue. Now, the way that the NRA and the gun manufacturers have worked historically in America is that a lot of guns are sold every single year, and the gun manufacturers, Beretta, Benelli, Heckler & Koch, companies like that, have been major donors to the NRA. That's how they are able to lobby, to make donations to politicians on both sides of the aisle across the country. Now, with the spread, inevitably, eventually, of 3D gun printing, at some point, this is going to cut into the profits of those corporations. When Netflix became big, Blockbuster took it on the chin. You have to expect that the rise of pirated ebooks have something to do with the fact that these large bookstores have started to close down around the country. Now, I don't think that 3D printed guns are going to be as popular as pirated copies of the Game of Thrones, but at some point it should have an impact. And the reason for that is that while these 3D printed guns at this point are simply single-shot guns that can't really stand up to what you can find in any Walmart, in just a couple of weeks since the original Liberator was sold, there's now one called the Lulz Liberator that can hold 9 bullets and is slightly more resilient, less likely to break down after each firing. This is after just a couple of weeks. Now, once these 3D printed guns, the plans are crowdsourced across the country, and we have 6 months or a year of 2 years of development, is it really all that impossible to imagine that they'll come up with guns that can rival those put out every day by Beretta and Benelli? I think that it's entirely possible. I know that I personally am very interested in printing out replicas of, fantasy swords and warhammers and things like that. If you can make those, you can also make the guns. And so, at some point, as this eats into the profits of these large gun manufacturers, I expect that donations to the NRA will also go down. Now, that could very well be offset by donations by individuals. That is not impossible at this point. But because the NRA in the last few decades has relied so much on donations from these large manufacturers, it could very well have a long-term impact on the NRA. Now, it's impossible at this point to speculate out a decade, 2 decades into how much impact this will have on gun policies in America, but it's an interesting thing to, keep in mind. And I am sure that the man who invented the Liberator did not expect that at some point this might lead to a massive change in the power of the NRA. Okay, let's take a very short break. When we come back, we're going to look at some of the evidence that might lead you to believe that Grover Norquist is a Muslim. Back in just a minute. And welcome back to the second half of the program. 4 more stories for you. Some of these are going to be a little bit ridiculous. They're nothing but fun. And eventually we will get to responses to your Twitter and YouTube comments. But we're going to be starting off with Kathy Adams. Is it possible that Grover Norquist is a secret Muslim? There's some new evidence that's come out that might lead you to believe that that's the case, or probably not. But first we're going to talk about the woman who has put out this theory. That is Kathy Adams. Probably not familiar with her. I wasn't before this, but we're going to tell you all about her. She is the president of the Texas Eagle Forum, and she was recently doing a PowerPoint presentation on radical Islam and the Muslim Brotherhood. This was sponsored by the Far North Dallas Tea Party. They posted this video where she talked about some of her theories. Now, from the title of that PowerPoint presentation, you won't be surprised to find out that she sees the creeping power of Islam all over the country, what she calls stealth jihad. Now, she's previously railed against, this man, Amir Omar. He ran for Congress as a Republican back in 2006, and she thinks that at least she was instrumental in stopping him from being elected to Congress. Eventually, she was known for questioning a former Bush administration official, and also conservative activist, by the way, Suhail Khan, saying, "Where did he come from? How did this man get here? Did he overstay a visa?" Turns out he was born in Colorado. She doesn't know how to use Google, I suppose. Although she does know how to put together a PowerPoint presentation, so that's a point in her favor. Now she's attacking Grover Norquist. Now, you might say that doesn't make any sense. You have the Tea Party, this woman who is a big Tea Party official, and anti-tax activist Grover Norquist. So how could he possibly be a Muslim? Well, he did marry a Muslim woman, so guilt by association, I suppose. And by the way, and then she goes on to say, oftentimes we like what he says about economic issues, but he is in fact trouble with a capital T. After all, he is showing signs of converting to Islam himself. She shows a picture of him. As you see, he has a beard. Now, you might react with, well, that's crazy. Yeah, he has a beard. That doesn't mean he's a Muslim. Lots of people who aren't Muslims have beards. That's true. But I've noticed in my past that these bearded individuals often lead questionable lives. And it makes me wonder, in hindsight, were they possible Muslims as well? Uncle Sam, for instance, always talking about war. Why is he constantly talking about needing to invade other countries? Now, he doesn't use the term jihad, but that seems to be how he leads his life. Gandalf put together a secret cell that invaded Mordor. Questionable behavior. He consorts with people who use magic and these mystical voodoos and stuff like that. Possible secret Muslim in Middle-earth. There's also Tom Hanks in Castaway. Nah, I love Tom Hanks. Can't really fault him. He's a lovely guy. And so, yeah, obviously this is ridiculous. All jokes aside, Grover Norquist occasionally says some reasonable things, I suppose, but historically, he does not seem to have the best interests of America at heart, and so you'd think that they would be perfect bedmates, but unfortunately not. Now, moving past the Grover Norquist stuff, because that's obviously ridiculous, I think that she only said it to get news, and so mission accomplished, I suppose. But she's simply not happy anymore, I suppose, with attacking the U.S. government, attacking Barack Obama. And once again, we see these references to stealth jihad, to creeping Islam across America, the possibility of Sharia law being followed or being imposed on different communities. And this is ridiculous. I think that you are smart enough to understand that this is ridiculous. There's almost nothing less likely to be a threat to the U.S. government. I was able to catalog a couple of things, actually. I found the threat of lizard people in government. We found out recently that about 1 in 20 Americans believe that lizard people control the U.S. government. That's less likely than Sharia law being imposed across America. Government controlling tornadoes. Recent conspiracy theory by Alex Jones. He believes that Oklahoma was some sort of false flag, and that the government has a machine that lets them create tornadoes. That is less likely than Sharia law across the country. And also the possibility of us being herded into hobbit homes thanks to the UN's Agenda 21. This is Louis Gohmert's little pet theory. And I actually don't understand why it's so bad. Now, maybe he has a nice house, but for me, those hobbit homes are delightful and much bigger than the apartment I currently live in. So I would be fine with that. But despite my willingness to engage in this hobbit homery, less likely than Islam taking over America. And so I cover it when it comes up, when they say these crazy things, but maybe you out there can enlighten me. Why is it that they're so constantly worried about Islam, about Sharia law in America, when we know that it's almost impossible that even in local communities we could see Islamic law being imposed on Americans? I honestly don't have answers at this point. It's something that I'm going to continue to follow because it's interesting. And I suppose so long as the Tea Party and their representatives are attacking these boogeymen, I guess that undercuts their argument and makes them a little bit easier to defeat in elections. So maybe that's a silver lining, I suppose. Anyway, let's move on to Barack Obama. He's back in the news. He is the president after all. Barack Obama was at a Democratic fundraiser in Chicago recently, and one of the topics that he brought up was climate change. Now, once again, this is an area where, at least in his rhetoric, Barack Obama gets it right. Now, he talks a little bit about climate change, and it's clear that he understands the threat, at least to some extent. He says, "We also know that the climate is warming faster than anybody anticipated 5 or 10 years ago, and that the future, in part, is going to depend on our willingness to deal with something that we may not be able to see or smell the way you could when the Chicago River was on fire, or at least could have caught on fire, but is in some ways more serious, more fundamental." And so he understands that while there's still some debate over climate change in the media, at least, it is a serious threat to America. And so he gets points, at least for the rhetoric. But then he goes on to talk about how the government can actually do something about climate change and his willingness to work with people who have differing opinions. And that's where he loses me at least a little bit. He says, if I've got somebody who has a different approach to dealing with climate change, I don't have much patience for people who deny climate change, but if you've got creative approaches, market-based approaches, tell me about them. If you think I'm doing it the wrong way, let me know. I'm happy to work with you. I personally think we're a couple of decades past I'm happy to work with you in this country. Now, he understands, or at least seems to understand, the severity of this threat. But then there's this huge gap between that understanding and his approach to actually dealing with it as the most powerful man in the country and possibly the most powerful single man in the world. We need to deal with this threat. We are running out of time. Recently, you might have noticed that the parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere went above 400 for the first time. I recently just, for fun, I guess, watched An Inconvenient Truth, and they talked about, look out if it goes above 300. That movie apparently is now very dated since we've gone 30% above that. This is a serious problem that will require a serious governmental approach to fixing it. And look, the government, when it actually acts on these sorts of important worldwide global issues, can actually do something. You know, there was the hole in the ozone layer. Internationally, we fought against the chemicals that were causing it, and that now is not nearly as much of a problem. Acid rain in America, massive problem. Actually very similar in terms of what you need to do to regulate it, although I suppose a little bit easier, but this was something that was difficult at the time to deal with. Thankfully, acid rain not nearly as much of a problem in America as it was in decades past. So this is something that we know we need to deal with. He at least acknowledges that we need to deal with it. But you can't simply say, people who have differing opinions on climate change, we can sort of split the difference and half wreck the environment? No, at some point you need to speak out, and you need to say you need to use stronger words, I guess I would say, than he doesn't have much patience for climate change deniers. These people are those who occasionally in the Senate and the House want to work with him on dealing with the economy and dealing with healthcare and issues like that. These are not necessarily rational or reasonable people. He needs to speak out against them so that in the next election, the next series of elections, we can get them out of office. Because, unfortunately, so long as the House is in control of the Republicans, the chance that any sort of serious legislation that could fix parts of the problem when it comes to climate change, carbon sequestration, things like that, they're simply not going to pass the House, as extreme as it is right now. So we need to do what we can, not just when the election is ongoing. We need to do what we can now to get it to be an issue that people will care about going into the next election. That's the only way that we're going to clear the House and the Senate of these climate change deniers and get some actual headway on fixing the problem with the climate. So I guess I'll give him some points for speaking out, keeping in the news. I'm not missing, of course, the fact that this was spoken at a fundraiser. That's probably the only reason he brought it up in the first place. So he gets, I guess, a C, but more needs to be done. Okay, this is actually fun news, so I'm actually excited for this one.
The reason coke and weed are illegal in America is because the best coke and weed ain't made in America. If they made the good shit here, there'd be a coke and weed restaurant on every fucking corner. That's right. Wouldn't be no Starbucks, it'd be Weed Bucks.
Now, in Colorado, in Washington, recreational marijuana has been legalized, and so we should not be surprised that Chris Rock was correct. We will currently, in the near future, see a Weed Bucks, thanks to the work of Jamin Shively. Probably not familiar with him. He's a former Microsoft manager, apparently a very rich man. He is going to be putting $100 million over the next 3 years into creating the first big brand marijuana company. We don't currently have a name for it. There is a name for the company. It is named after his father, but I imagine they're going to have to come up with something more clever when they actually want to market it. You have to have a cool name. You have to have a mascot. That's the only way you're going to market a product that is predominantly going to be going to, I guess, the 18 to 35 demographic. Now, to give you some information about what's been going on, he announced recently that he would be putting this massive amount of money into creating this brand. Now, we expect that he will have some pushback from the federal government since they're not happy with the move by Colorado and Washington to legalize this. We've seen recently that publications in Colorado that deal with marijuana will be regulated in a similar fashion as pornographic magazines in Colorado. Now, there are, of course, court cases on First Amendment grounds against that right now in Colorado. We don't know which way they're going to go. But of course, that is, I guess, a necessary first step towards actually having this, to having marijuana in these states be accessible and available in the same way that cigarettes, that alcohol and things like that are. So I'm not surprised that Jamin Shively is making this move. He's the first businessman to announce something like this. He does have some support on his side. Vicente Fox, by the way, the former president of Mexico, spoke out recently in favor of this. Now, he, in the past, has made big news arguing against the current state of the drug war between the United States and Mexico. Now, I guess the legalization and marketing of marijuana is not necessarily going to do much by itself to fight against this drug war, but it is a good step, at least on the state level. And so he's speaking out in favor of Shively's moves. I'm interested to know what you think. Now, we know that marijuana is legalized in these two states. It's likely that with changing opinions of marijuana in different states across the country, it will become legalized in other states once these ballot measures are passed. But in terms of how it'll be available, it seems difficult to imagine a world where you can walk into a 7-Eleven and Shively brand marijuana will be there in a cool little colored package. I guess I expect that it's going to be a long time till we move past dispensaries and things like that. Now, we expected that the big industries would eventually take this over. It's not just going to be mom and pop dispensaries at some point, but it seems like it's going to take so very long. Now, I don't live in Colorado. I don't live in Washington. I don't know what people there expect, I suppose. So for those of you living in those states, let me know. Do you expect that they'll be as available as Marlboros in the next few decades? To me, that seems incredibly unlikely. But I guess this is the cutting edge of American politics. So that's all the political stories we have for you. I do want to do a little bit of community interaction with you. We have yet another round of the weekly roundup for you. Twitter and YouTube comments that I will respond to. I got a couple of them just today, actually, that were quite interesting. So I'm going to be starting with Jeremy Effinger. He's appeared on the weekly roundup before. He says, if you were stuck on a deserted island with one other member from the TYT staff, who would you want it to be and why? This is not going to surprise anyone. I guess I would have to choose Anna Kasparian. If for no other reason, then she, at some point, she gets in her goofy moods, I suppose, but when shit needs to be done, she will get shit done. We need to build a hut, a raft, something like that. Anna Kasparian does not fuck around. She doesn't seem like one to break under the pressure either, which I think would be important. When you're trying to, I guess, gather water, hunt down crabs and things like that, I'm basically going off of my experience with Castaway, to survive, you don't also want to have to play therapist every day to somebody who's breaking under the pressure of island life. Christian Marasico says, how scientific is political science and how scientific could it be? I think he understands that I was a political science graduate student. Many people believe that political science is not much of a science at all, and they would levy that accusation at almost all of the social sciences, but I think that that's unfair. I think that if the social sciences, and particularly political science, seem unscientific, it's only because we're dealing with an incredibly difficult to study variable, and that is human behavior. Now, when we're trying to analyze the behavior of politicians, of Supreme Court justices, the human brain is an incredibly complicated thing to study, especially when, in politics, they're actively trying to deceive you most of the time. And also, American politics has so many different influences from, popular opinion, the influence of some issues being salient in the population and others not, this changing over time, donations from politicians, from interest groups, and all of these things. It's incredibly hard to break down specifically what causes a particular phenomenon, a particular law to pass, for instance, a particular politician to be elected. So I do think that political science is a science. It is incredibly scientific, but it is dealing with a very difficult issue. It's like trying to study pool when the pool table has thousands of balls all ricocheting off of each other at the same time. It's incredibly difficult. It does not make it unscientific. Imen Udu says, how come you've decided to have alternating co-hosts instead of a permanent one, and will they be all from the existing TYT crew? Now they're talking about the other channel that I host, TYT University. I will answer that here because I haven't gotten around to answering it on TYTU. Now, this is not a decision that has been made. This is simply what's happened the last couple of weeks, and it will happen for at least the next couple of weeks in the future. As you may know, Lisa Ferguson has moved away. Now, she will still be involved in the channel, although remotely. And it is not an easy thing to find a permanent co-host. And honestly, at this point, with her just recently having left, it's not something I'm excited to do, I guess. It's a nice opportunity to have different co-hosts each week, and I think that does bring something to the show. We had Anna Kasparian, Hermela Argawi, Sam Shocker is going to be hosting next week, and I think that it's kind of cool to have different opinions being brought to bear on the stories with every passing week. They will not all be drawn from existing TYTU crew. I do have a couple of people who haven't currently or in the past shown up on the channel who will be doing some guest hosting in the near future, and I'm personally excited about it. I hope that the audience is also excited about it. Final comment, this is coming from a YouTube comment on the past Weekly Roundup episode. This is from Purple Scout Cookies. They say, what do you think about the MOBA community, League, Dota, Heroes of Newerth community in comparison to MMOs like WoW and EVE? I wonder what technology is involved in MOBAs that make it one of the rudest communities out there. And so for some reason I get a lot of comments about video games, and it's something that I'm interested in, so I'll answer that here. I think that the communities from different genres of games can be very different, and it's not too hard to figure out why. Now let's take a game like League of Legends or Dota and compare it to something like Call of Duty. Now Call of Duty does not have a particularly, I guess, inviting or friendly community, but while you'll get insulted there, they don't really attack you for your skill all that much, or at least on your teams that's not very common, and it's incredibly common in League, Dota, Heroes of Newerth, MOBA games of this sort. And the reason for that, I guess, is it's as simple as the length of individual games. Now, a deathmatch or team deathmatch game in Call of Duty could be 8 minutes long or something like that. It's a very quick turnaround on the game. So if you lose, there's another game coming in just 10 minutes. Whereas in League or in Dota, these games can be 20, 30, 40, 50 minutes or longer. And you can't surrender all that easily, especially in Dota. I don't even think they have any capacity for surrendering. And so, if you find yourself on a team with a person that you think is not doing well, and you're a troll or an asshole, you're going to let them know it. And the reason for that is this is what you're stuck with for the next 30 to 40 minutes. I think that it's really as simple as that. I don't know that demographically there's any major difference between these different genres. It's possible that gamers in general are younger now with the rise of consoles and networked internet and things like that. But I think it's the investment of the individual games. I think that when the games are long, and especially when, in the case of these MOBAs, you're being ranked in a lot of cases, you have your ELO visible, I think that then it's very easy for people to get worked up about it. The comparison I like to make generally is to something like pickup volleyball or basketball. Generally, people don't care all that much if they lose. Now, you might have to sit out a game, and that's certainly a consequence, but there's no ongoing tally of your wins and losses. If you were to ask Ricky Strom of TYT Sports what his win-to-loss ratio in pickup basketball is, he'd have no clue. But on the other hand, if there was some, I guess, government drone watching and keeping a record of his wins and losses, he might care more about those losses. And so that's another influence over MOBAs. Now, those are the two things I think that have a big impact on it. If you have something else that you think is influencing this, feel free to let me know. Now, I would say that if you agree with me that the community sucks, the easy solution is just to find friends to play with. Now, when I play, I'm often on Skype with 3, 4, 5 other people for a full group, and I think that that's an easy solution. If the community is toxic, don't play with the community. Anyway, if you have questions you'd like to see on the next edition of the Weekly Roundup, feel free to leave them in the comments section. You can tweet me at John Iadarola, of course. I love hearing your thoughts and questions. Excuse me. So that is all the stories we've got time for today. Once again, it's been a pleasure coming in on the weekends to give you these little news tidbits, international stories that don't make it onto the main show. There's issues that don't get covered simply because we don't have time, and so it's actually an honor of mine to be able to cover those. If you have suggestions for stories, feel free to let me know. I love covering the stories that you are personally invested in, and so let me know via Twitter or comments, and I'll see you next week for another episode of the show.